Hey everybody, Aaron Mac BS Detector. I am going to try this one more time. Now I have offloaded like pretty much every app on my phone. I've deleted so much stuff, like I don't even know what else to do at this point. But I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep trying to read this. I just don't have any room like in my phone. I don't know what I've got an iMac laptop. I think I need to get like an external hard drive or something so that I can start doing a better job at this. Also, I've got OBS on my computer so I can do a little bit of editing and stuff and maybe set it up to where I could go live. So please subscribe if you haven't. I'm trying to get up to 100 so I can at least go live on YouTube because I feel like, there's more of a better crowd that like, I feel like is interested in the more long form kind of content. And also I feel like YouTube, the algo will maybe push you out there. TikTok is more used for like I've gone live on TikTok and I sat there for 5 minutes and my niece got on the live. I mean, so it was like, okay. And I know it was in the middle of the day, but still. Anyways, we are reading The 13th Tribe by Arthur Kessler. I don't know if you watch the Olive Roots podcast, but dude is doing an amazing job over there. I think his name is Kotzi. Really cool dude. He's a Palestinian Christian guy and he is awesome. Anyways, he knows what's up. Go check out his channel. So this is ironically called the Exodus, this chapter 5 that I'm about to start reading. Section 1. The evidence quoted in the previous pages indicates that contrary to the traditional view held by 19th century historians, the Khazars, after the defeat by the Russians in 965, lost their empire but retained their independence with narrower frontiers and their Judaic faith. Well into the 13th century, they even seem to have reverted to some extent to their erstwhile predatory habits, Barron comments. In general, the reduced Khazar kingdom preserved. It waged a more or less effective defense against all foes until the middle of the 13th century, when it fell victim to the great Mongol invasion set in motion by Genghis Khan. Even then, it resisted stubbornly until the surrender of all its neighbors. Its population was largely absorbed by the Golden Horde, which had established the center of its empire in Khazar territory. But before and after the Mongol upheaval, the Khazars sent many offshoots into the unsubdued Slavonic lands, helping ultimately to build up the great Jewish centers of Eastern Europe. Here, then, we have the cradle of the numerically strongest and culturally dominant part of modern Jewry. The quote, offshoots, end quote, to which Barron refers, were indeed branching out long before the destruction of the Khazar state by the Mongols, as the ancient Hebrew nation had started branching into the diaspora long before the destruction of Jerusalem. Ethnically, the Semitic tribes on the waters of the Jordan and the Turco-Khazar tribes on the Volga were, of course, quote-unquote, miles apart. But they had at least two important formative factors in common. Each lived at a focal junction where the great trade routes connecting east and west, north and south intersect, a circumstance which predisposed them to become nations of traders, of enterprising travelers, or rootless cosmopolitans, as hostile propaganda has unaffectionately labeled them. But at the same time, their exclusive religion fostered a tendency to keep to themselves and stick together, to establish their own communities with their own places of worship, schools, residential quarters, and ghettos, originally self-imposed. So all that victim crap, it's like, no, y'all wanted to be separated. In whatever town or country they settled, this rare combination of wanderlust and ghetto mentality, reinforced by messianic hopes and chosen race pride, both ancient Israelites and medieval Khazars shared, even though the latter traced their descent not to Shem but to Japheth. So these people today calling you anti-Semitic for being critical of a geopolitical state called Israel that has nothing to do with the people from the Bible will call you anti-Semitic for disagreeing with them. And they are not Semitic at all. It says so right there. And I mean, anybody with common sense that's read even the Bible, it's when it tells you the genealogies of Noah, there was Shem, Ham, and Japheth had a son called Ashkenaz. That is who these people are. They're descendants of Ashkenaz. They're Ashkenazi Jays. They're not Semitic. To be Semitic, you have to be a descendant of Shem. Okay? Section 2. This development is well illustrated by what one might call the Khazar diaspora in Hungary. And see how they're trying to kind of mimic a little bit this so that they can pretend to understand. It's crazy. We remember that long before the destruction of their state, several Khazar tribes known as Kabars joined the Magyars and migrated to Hungary. Moreover, in the 10th century, the Hungarian Duke Taxany invited a second wave of Khazar immigrants to settle in his domains. 2 centuries later, John Cinemas, the Byzantine chronicler, mentions troops observing the Jayish law fighting with the Hungarian army in Dalmatia in AD 1154. There may have been small numbers of, quote, real Jews, whatever that means, living in Hungary from Roman days, but there can be little doubt that the majority of this important portion of modern Jewry originated in the migratory waves of Kabar Khazars, who play such a dominant part in early Hungarian history. Not only was the country, as Constantine tells us, bilingual at its beginning, but it also had a form of double kingship, a variation of the Khazar system. The king sharing power with his general in command, who bore the title of Gyula or Gyula, still a popular Hungarian first name. The system lasted to the end of the 10th century, when Saint Stephen embraced the Roman Catholic faith and defeated a rebellious Julia, who, as one might expect, was a Khazar, quote, vain in the faith and refusing to become a Christian. This episode put an end to the double kingship, but not to the influence of the Khazar Jayish community in Hungary. A reflection of what influence can be found in the, quote, Golden Bull, the Hungarian equivalent of the Magna Carta, issued AD 1222 by King Andrei, in which Jays were forbidden to act as mint masters, tax collectors, and controllers of the royal salt monopoly, indicating that before the edict, numerous Jays must have held these important posts, but they probably got caught stealing, by usury and whatnot, like they do today, and they probably weren't allowed to do that anymore. But that's just a guess. But they occupied even more exalted positions. King Andrei's custodian of the revenues of royal chamber was the Chamberlain Count Tika, a Jay of Khazar origin, a rich landowner and apparently a financial and diplomatic genius. His signature appears on various peace treaties and financial agreements, among them one guaranteeing the payment of 2,000 marks by the Austrian ruler Leopold II to the King of Hungary. One is irresistibly reminded of a similar role played by the Spanish Jay Hasdai ibn Shaprut in the court of the Caliph of Cordoba. Comparing similar episodes from the Palestinian diaspora in the West and the Khazar diaspora in the east of Europe makes the analogy between them appear perhaps less tenuous. It is also worth mentioning that when King Andrei was compelled by his rebellious nobles to issue reluctantly the Golden Bull, he kept Tika in office against the bull's express provisions. The royal chamberlain held his post happily for another 11 years until papal pressure on the king made it advisable for Tika to resign and betake himself to Austria, where he was received with open arms. However, King Andrei's son Bela IV obtained papal permission to call him back. Tika duly returned and perished during the Mongol invasion. I am indebted to Mrs. St. G. Saunders for calling my attention to the Tika episode, which seems to have been overlooked in the literature on the Khazars. Okay, section 3. The Khazar origin of the numerically and socially dominant element of the Jayish population of Hungary during the Middle Ages is thus relatively well documented. It might seem that Hungary constitutes a special case in view of the early Magyar-Khazar connection, but in fact, the Khazar influx into Hungary was merely a part of the general mass migration from the Eurasian steppes toward the west, i.e., toward Central and Eastern Europe. The Khazars were not the only nation which sent offshoots into Hungary. Thus, large numbers of the self-same Pechenegs who had chased the Magyars from the Don across the Carpathians were forced to ask for permission to settle in Hungarian territory when they in turn were chased by the Cumans, and the Cumans shared the same fate when, a century later, they fled from the Mongols, and some 40,000 of them, quote, with their slaves, end quote, were granted asylum by the Hungarian king Bela. At relatively quiescent times, this general westward movement of the Eurasian populations was no more than a drift. At other times it became a stampede, but the consequences of the Mongol invasion must rank on this metaphoric scale as an earthquake followed by a landslide. The warriors of Chief Tejuman, called Genghis Khan, Lord of the Earth, massacred the population of whole cities as a warning to others not to resist, used prisoners as living screens in front of their advancing lines, destroyed the irrigation network of the Volga Delta, which had provided the Khazar lands with rice and other staple foods, and transformed the fertile steppes into the, quote, wild fields, the Dikoye Pole, as the Russians were later to call them. An unlimited space without farmers or shepherds, through which only mercenary horsemen pass in the service of this or that rival ruler, or people escaping from such rule, end quote. The Black Death of 1347 through 48 accelerated the progressive depopulation of the former Khazar heartland between Caucasus, Don, and Volga, where the steppe culture had reached its highest level, and the relapse into barbarism was, by contrast, more drastic than in adjoining regions. As Barron wrote, quote, the destruction or departure of industrious Jayish farmers, artisans, and merchants left behind a void which in those regions had only recently begun to be filled, end quote. Not only Khazaria was destroyed, but also the Volga-Bulgar country, together with the last Caucasian strongholds of the Alans and the Cumans, and the southern Russian principalities, including Kiev. During the period of disintegration of the Golden Horde from the 14th century onward, the anarchy became, if possible, even worse. Quote, in most of the European steppes, immigration was the only way left open for populations who wanted to secure their lives and livelihood, end quote. The migration towards safer pastures was a protracted, intermittent process which went on for several centuries. The Khazar exodus was part of the general picture. It had been preceded, as already mentioned, by the founding of Khazar colonies and settlements in various places in the Ukraine and southern Russia. There was a flourishing Jayish community in Kiev long before and after the Rus took the town from the Khazars. Similar colonies existed in Pereslavl and Chernigov. A Rabbi Moshe of Kiev studied in France around 1160, and a Rabbi Abraham of Chernigov studied in 1181 in the Talmud School of London. Quote, the Lay of Iger's Host, end quote, mentions a famous contemporary Russian poet called Kogan, possibly a combination of Cohen, which is the priest, and Kagan. Sometime after Sarkol, which the Russians called Bielovitsa, was destroyed, the Khazars built the town of the same name near Chernigov. There is an abundance of ancient place names in the Ukraine and Poland, which derive from Khazar or Zid, which means Jew. Ziduo, Kozarzewek, Kozara, Kozarzao, Ziadowska, Vola, and Zedaktitsa, and so on. They may have once been villages or just temporary encampments of Khazar Jewish communities on their long trek to the west. Similar place names can also be found in the Carpathian and Tatra mountains and in the eastern provinces of Austria. Even the ancient Jewish cemeteries of Krakow and Sandomierz, both called Kaviori, are assumed to be of Khazar Kabar origin. While the main route of the Khazar exodus led to the west, some groups of people were left behind, mainly in the Crimea and the Caucasus, where they formed Jewish enclaves surviving into modern times. In the ancient Khazar stronghold of Tamatarka, or Taman, facing the Crimea across the Straits of Kerch, we hear of a dynasty of Jewish princes who ruled in the 15th century under the tutelage of the Genovese Republic, and later of the Crimean Tartars. The Tartars! I wonder if that's the same as like Tartarians? Maybe not. I don't know. The last of them, Prince Zakaria,